Divine Set 2 Illusionless Strife is finally out in English, and today we're going to break down the top 10 decks from this set's format. The data used for this top 10 is provided by VG Paradox, sourcing from tournaments that occurred during this set's release period in the Japanese format. A very important disclaimer before we get into the top 10 is that these results take place after the restriction of Lard and Shiranui, with Lard losing Sergaon and Shiranui losing the Shoujo Doji ride line and access to Drag Veda, the Dragon Empire overtrigger. While these changes have not been announced for English yet, this ranking is presented under the assumption that these restrictions will be implemented in English soon. Illusionless Strife was another fantastic set and a change of pace in a way, being the first main set in a year to not include triple rare generic cycler cards for every single nation, but just a couple, and instead dedicating more triple rare slots to supporting core decks, or giving these kind of cards additional effects that can function generically too. And the number 10 slot will feature a deck that uses a card like that, which is Dredjeweled with the new support of Bifronts. Dredjeweled struggled to exist in a format where Shiranui was the best deck, as Ignis being dominated meant that you're giving your opponent 6 drive checks total in a turn. With Shiranui becoming a less common matchup, Dredjeweled is able to make use of its constant back row wiping, offensive pressure, and new access to resources with Bifronts to beat many of the lower tier decks, and chuck most of its energy away with Tizcar. The deck saw a lot of success with a back-to-back 2-day-in-a-row win at Torika Fest and Ultimate. Just be careful not to deck yourself out from spamming Bifronts' top 3 skill, as you do have to add 1 to hand, 1 to soul, and discard the rest. Nothing goes back to deck. In 9th, we have She Who Waited for multi-attack for 3 whole years, Seraph Purelight. The addition of Corner Citrus was a huge buff to the deck, being able to now not only strip resources from your opponent with Purelight, but also have a potential of 5 attacks per turn with the exorbitant power provided by Purelight's buff. The main difficulty in this deck is where your counterblast gets committed to, whether you build board with Lethal Royal or restand with Citrus. With there being a lot of decks that abuse grade 2 or lower strong attackers in this meta, such as Leonorn or Blackmire, Fairy Violet makes a return as a pseudo-perfect guard that doesn't say Sentinel on it. On top of all that, Prison has some mini floodgates in Muna and Taser Large to disrupt your opponent, solidifying its place in the competitive scene. Falling from grace all the way to 8th after the restriction is Lard. Losing his best friend Sergon was far more damaging than expected, strapping away the best early game the deck had. Instead, many players pivoted to the slower and grindier versions of Lard that used Diorwing and a high count of draw triggers to discard for constant perfect guard use. Lard will continue to adapt and evolve with the release of Festival Booster, and especially excels in metas where slower and grindier decks want to try and outgrind it. Again, keep in mind that this is talking about Lard after losing Sergon, which I do expect it to lose in the next restriction list for English. In 7th, we see Welstra with this list that came top 4 at Torika Fest. With many long game focused decks entering the meta, Welstra has adapted to a more grindy variation with Bergina, and while many lists have been using 3 to 4 copies of the brand new triple rare Balderreed, many Welstra players have been using those 4 slots for a mix of 2 to 4 copies of Ainz and or Zoetain, depending on whether you want to push for more countercharge or additional card draw while generating soul for Bergina and Freiheit. Welstra will continue to not only be a powerful deck in the format due to its constant pressure, retiring, and resource generation, but it will also soon become a very budget-friendly top tier with the incoming reprint of Freiheit in Festival Booster 2024. 6th place will be by far the most unbelievable to most viewers, but the data does not lie. In Japan, it was actually Shiranui. After the restriction, many lost hope in the deck as it lost its early game options, and the set was the least dominated period of Divine so far, as this deck will become a powerhouse once more with the release of Festival Booster. The main adaptations most lists saw were the change of the Dragon Empire overtrigger to Eidos Faro, and Shenri stayed as one of the few early game pressure cards paired with Tende. Now, the deck aims to draw out the game with its powerful multi-attackers, 1 to 2 copies of the Roar Blitz Order, and Farhat. Again, if you're still playing in the current English tournaments, the Shoujo Doji ride line, etc. are still available to use, so Shiranui probably would rank a lot higher, but if we are assuming that the restrictions from Japan will carry over to English, I think this placement is more true to where it will stand, until Festival Booster. Before we enter our top 5, it's time for some honorable mentions that unfortunately didn't quite make the top 10 cut. Mygo, which did make the top 10 last set, has been docked down a couple ranks due to some of the older decks getting stronger positions or new decks entering the tiers. That being said, seeing how cheap this deck still is in English, it's by far the best budget pick in the game right now. Speaking of budget, Lascaria Veleno got 1 new double rare and 1 new rare in this set and already found herself placing in tournaments this season, and the deck can be built very easily on a budget requiring no Stoicheia generics. The latter Regulus piece here can technically be replaced for most other Regulus pieces, but do keep in mind that even ladder drops down to the $10 to $15 range after its reprint in set 3. Hyoka was my team's secret weapon during this set, receiving support in set set 2 with Freydis being an in-deck magazine and a Persona Ride or magazine recycler, allowing the deck to have more consistency, and Elsbeth providing soul and hitting the 2 of each different grade on field very easily. A generic that was slept on at the beginning of the set's release in Japan was Francette, being basically a grade 2 Yuika without the soul cost, but instead requiring different named units on board, something that Kyoka already does. Definitely a deck to keep on your radars this set. Leonorn is back in the honorable mentions one last time before she enters the top 10 in the festival booster ranking. Receiving Broccoli was one of the most powerful support cards in being a permanent 15k beater with 10k shield that draws cards, which gave Leonorn even better early game and is very hard to answer going second, as that 15k power sticks around, forcing you to commit a booster behind Vanguard to even try to take it out. We'll talk more about her in the next top 10, so we'll leave it here. Finally, Francette shown in more than just Kyoka, as Fennel got a great boost out of her too. I've already featured Fennel on the channel, so make sure to check that video out if you're curious, but this deck came out of nowhere with multiple tournament placements, causing many to experiment with her high caliber attacks, although in my personal playtesting it did start to become clear that the deck really does fall apart if you don't see Storeja to help find your other pieces, or if your ride line doesn't pick up enough orders. Back to the list, in 5th we have one of the new fated ones from the set, and it's Blackmire. The initial reaction had everyone thinking that this would be a tier 0 deck, but with players quickly figuring out the counterplay, Blackmire finds itself in the dead center of this top 10. The premise of the deck is that it greatly benefits players who are excellent at bluffing. Your way of approaching the battle phase will dictate how the opponent guards, and mainly how you can bait out their defenses and bluff on whether you will or won't use your divine skill, which shuts off all sentinels for the turn while gaining a critical and immense amount of power. Blackmire gets great support from its attackers, mainly Zamoog filtering your deck while building soul and being a 2 crit attacker to push your opponent to 3 to 4, where Blackmire is most lethal at, and Falkrashia gives you high numbers while refueling your soul for each Blackmire skill use. The deck is capable of constantly deck thinning while generating resources, although many have found that carefully guarding early turns and dictating the pace of the game will often put Blackmire players in an awkward state as they use their divine skill out of desperation before hitting deck out. In 4th, Resel finds itself with a build relatively similar to the last set, but now with the inclusion of a couple new tools. Liela Morta isn't going to be seeing her anime-like feature just yet, but the deck now has access to more consistent ways of activating the divine skill's miracle thanks to the addition of Nilberis. He gets an additional 10k power when called by your Vanguard's effect, and after attacking, he lets you use 3 energy and chuck him into the soul to draw a card, and then check the top card of your deck and leave it on top or bottom. This is effectively what Inlet Pulse was doing a few years ago, providing soul, which is precious for this deck, letting you draw extra cards, and even setting up your drive checks if you attack with him before the Vanguard, or damage checks if you leave him for the last attacks of the turn. He also pairs well with Sergaon, letting you resolve this and stack the top card that you can then add to hand with Sergaon's end of boost effect. Speaking of doggos, the newest member of the family is Gragaon, supporting Keter Divine Seal units that call cards mid-battle, such as Liel, Resel, and maybe even the new Alden? Who knows? He's basically a 13k booster that can also function as additional countercharger, and him retiring himself means that he works very well with how Resel's attack pattern often goes. Thanks to these additions, Resel looks to be very solid in this set's meta, with the lists changing a fair bit with how flexible he is. Before we count down our top 3, I just wanted to ask you guys to check if you're subscribed to the channel. These kinds of videos take a lot of time to make, and you supporting the channel and liking videos like this really helps in doing what I do. I also have channel membership exclusive videos of many of these set 2 decks being played from a first-person perspective, so if you want to give that extra bit of support to the channel, consider becoming a YouTube channel member for all kinds of benefits. For our top 3, in 3rd, you were probably waiting for it, it's Varga. I don't think I've seen a deck that people are more torn up about when discussing its power. For some it's the best deck in format, for others it doesn't even rank in. Of course, being a more trigger-reliant deck, it can definitely feel like it's tier 0 when you sack and tier 3 when you see nothing but blanks. However, at the end of the day, it is a big tempo-based deck, and this set gave it a new tool to push that tempo of gaining advantage over your opponent even further. Thanks to Rokusei, you now have a way to steal your opponent's ability to intercept for a whole turn, making Varga's front row retire finally have its full punishing effect. On top of that, it also has a self-retire to draw a card condition, except this one is the most restricted. A rearguard has to be retired in the same column as him, whether it's yours or your opponent's. That means that if you position it behind an Obduracy Glaive where your opponent never called something in the first place, you won't be able to activate it at all. Overall, this simple addition gave the deck a lot more tempo advantage in order to position itself well into the format. And in 2nd, it's finally time for me to gush about my wife who escaped the last top 10, Eva. Buffed by the incredible promo that is Imigrar, Eva is now capable of not only having a way to aggro your opponent from turn 1 going second, but now also generates advantage from the base form while raising the aggressive output with the Poison in Paradise form on turn 3. Counterblast has become less of an issue as well, allowing for Combine Rusher to come back in full force, so now Eva can revive up to 2 Combine Rushers with an Imigrar or 2 per turn just by setting 1 research order, which she searches out every turn to begin with. Even if you don't draw your 3rd research, now as long as you have Imigrar, you can just immediately ride to Poison in Paradise and search that 3rd set order and set it immediately to be ready for maximum offensive output. However, what really took the deck to the top in my opinion in set 2 is a new Blitz order, Freezing Wave. This allows you to Soul Blast 1 to gain plus 10k power defensively for every rested set order, which, in Eva's case, thanks to Blue Research Lab, is almost always at least 3. However, due to the adaptation of the Kaiju Research Order, which also rests itself, you can easily push this to 4, thus resulting in this being a 1-card 40k shield. Just as a reminder, Overtriggers, a 1 per deck, have 50k shield. This, you can easily play more than 1 of. Thanks to all the support, Eva has been able to play out long games while aggressively deck thinning, resulting in a compressed deck that delivers the lethal blow. The list you're seeing is also the one that I used to get top 8 in one of the biggest Vanguard tournaments of all time, WGP Tokyo, with 1,740 players. So I'm personally very proud that I could take her to the top during this format. The only issue Eva has is that there are decks that can outlast her, such as Lard that simply doesn't deck out, or our first place, Zorga. Zorga Nadir, the final divine skill possessing unit of the set, has statistically been the best achiever, and I personally felt that this deck was truly difficult to deal with even as an Eva player when put in a Zorga main's hands. The reason why I say this is that this deck is complex to play and requires a lot of practice and getting used to, so honestly if I were to use it, it would definitely rank below top 5. What makes Zorga be rated this highly is that this deck has by far the greatest stamina in the game in this specific format in my opinion. It can outlast the majority of matchups thanks to its ability to constantly recycle Perfect Guards and Persona Rides with Shadow Cloak. You play a diverse pool of orders and get to constantly reuse the ones necessary for the situation due to how Zorga Nadir's Alchemagic works. And once you've stalled out the game enough and you've seen your opponent Perfect Guard enough times, it's time to proc that divine skill and shut your opponent out of the game with the huge 4th attack. Some use the divine skill to gain tempo, others use it to win games, but just the threat of not knowing when your Zorga using opponent will activate it will often make you think twice while guarding and how you receive attacks. And as a result, the Zorga player can adapt their attack patterns to trick you into thinking that they'll use their divine skill too. Zorga is an incredibly high execution deck, and after Festival Booster, it will gain some worse matchups which will ultimately lead to it going down in the rankings, but do keep in mind that this is based on the Japanese tournament data as well. We've seen many times when the English side picks up where Japan left off and manages to adapt and shift the metagame in various ways. I also want to point out that Zorga is very flexible in how you build it, and we've seen a lot of Zorga mains cook up very different strategies, and unfortunately I'm not very good at playing Zorga, so I'm not exactly the best resource for it either. And with that, we conclude the top 10 for this set. Apologies for not getting this video out sooner, and thank you very much for watching. We'll be back very soon for another top 10 to reflect the Festival Booster meta, which will make up the majority of the summer months metas for the late Springfest season in English. I do want to first wait to see what they announce for the English restriction list though. With that, that'll be it for me today. Please like the video if you enjoyed it and subscribe if you haven't already. Otherwise, I'll see you guys next time. Bye bye.